to Exponential Finance, the podcast covering finance, technology and innovation, from our home in Japan and beyond. Kim Schumacher is a lecturer in Sustainable Finance and ESG at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. His research focuses on ESG data and impact metrics, sustainable finance frameworks, green bonds, natural capital valuation, ecosystem services, renewable energy project development, and climate-related risk disclosure. Kim is the creator and course director for Japan's very first graduate-level course on Sustainable Finance and ESG, part of the graduate major in Global Engineering for Development, Environment, and Society. In addition, he is an honorary research associate at the School of Geography and the Environment, University of Oxford. Kim is a chartered environmentalist and sits on the ISO technical committees on sustainable finance and environmental management. He also is a member of the technical working groups of the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the Climate Bonds Initiative, the ICMA Green Bond Principles, and the Green Finance Network Japan. And now, please welcome Kim Schumacher, lecturer at the Tokyo Institute of Technology.
Hi Kim, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
You are a very deep expert in ESG. From your resume, you studied a regular law degree, obtained that in Luxembourg, and then you went on to do that in the environmental context and basically have been focusing that now for about a decade.
Yeah, just a small clarification. So I'm originally from Luxembourg. I did obtain my law degree in France, and then went on to an exchange in the UK. And then once I finished my regular law studies, I was able to get a scholarship and go to the United States. And that is where at UC Berkeley, I studied environmental law. And that was around the time when the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power accident, the triple disaster in Japan happened. So around 2011. And that got me really interested in energy issues. And then after finishing my law studies in the United States, I felt that I want to delve deeper into the science elements behind it and the technology related elements, for example, renewable energy, because I was very interested in how Japan would manage the loss of nuclear power capacity basically overnight. That is when I decided I want to study more about renewable energy. And I wanted to go away from law. I also wanted to get more interdisciplinary knowledge. So I basically shifted from social science to natural science. I took the entrance exam at the University of Tokyo and started my PhD in environmental science, centering around environmental impact assessment data of large-scale renewable energy projects, notably wind and solar, not only in Japan, but in other OECD countries as well. So that is how I basically came around to the entire environmental policy angle, but also environmental science, the much more natural science-driven aspects of, for example, sustainability. After I graduated from the University of Tokyo in Japan, I was able to get a postdoc position in sustainable finance at the University of Oxford. And that is how I came in contact with the financial sector, with sustainability and finance and how it relates to financial decision-making. That also naturally led me to innovation, because talking about sustainable finance, and some of your listeners might already heard ESG, environmental, social, and governance inspired, or ESG investing. So basically investments that take into account ESG factors. So we're trying to not only address or mitigate risks that come from climate change and environmental degradation or social instability and governance related issues like corruption, but also try to look at what are the opportunities, basically taking on a much more proactive environmental position as a business. Are there any active benefits in terms of, for example, returns or revenue that come with that? And that is basically what I'm now focusing on, having come back to Japan in late 2019 to start a position as a lecturer here at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, where I do not only do teaching, but also do research. So that is a little bit of my track record so far. And I have my hands in a lot of pots. For example, I'm part of several bodies, not-for-profit bodies, but also several institutional regulatory bodies. For example, the International Standards Organization or the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, where I discuss about how should companies report risks? What is the role of data? And what is the role of, for example, promoting innovation that helps us also promote sustainability at the same time? And that is basically where I act and where I navigate my activities.
So when you see ESG, you wouldn't have thought first about the Tokyo Institute of Technology, but it's because of the connection through environmental sciences that you're also interested in the technology that improves these areas, that it's a TIT topic.
Exactly. That's a very good statement, because a lot of people associate sustainable finance mostly with finance. However, what has not been emphasized enough up to this point is that you also have the term sustainable in sustainable finance, or ESG also has the environmental aspect, ESG investing. So that is what we call non-financial elements. And non-financial elements, they need to be science-driven. We need to basically show proof of that there's a tangible impact in the sense, because otherwise it becomes what is known as greenwashing. So institutions or governments saying that they have a positive environmental impact or positive impact on sustainability, on sustainable development, without actually being able to prove that that is actually the case. And that is where marketing often becomes more important than actual action. And that is basically where science becomes a very important part, because if you look at science, for example, in terms of how scientific publishing goes, for example, you have the peer review process. And the peer review process is that any results that you want to publish in a journal, in a scholarly journal or scientific journal, will be reviewed to some extent by some of your peers, by experts who are already have a track record in that field, and who will anonymously look at your work and say whether or not that makes sense to them. And that acts sort of as a quality framework, a quality mechanism that allows the most poorly researched, poorly justified, or poorly explained results not to be published unless you provide additional data, or unless you are able to explain your results in a better way that becomes more comprehensive. And that is basically what sustainable finance ideally should be. It should be that merging of finance that takes into account risks from climate change and from environmental degradation, but on the other hand, does not make any empty promises either. It's actually finance that reports, that measures, reports, and properly verifies any of its potential impact, so that we are sure, that we have certainty that was actually promised is actually also occurring. And that is where basically science becomes very important. And that is something that I pursued through my research, through my teaching, and through my engagement with the industry in order to foster that to a much larger degree.
If you take the scientific approach on the one side, and there's finance or maybe specifically accounting on the other side, accounting seems to be anything but scientific. It seems to be more for a creative art where you can take quite a few latitudes of freedom in how you interpret the data, how you classify it, and you can come up with earnings before anything, right? Earnings before COVID at the end of the day, and declare anything that you don't like, non-recurring events, and then you come up with a number that looks good. And maybe that is part of the reason that the markets are where they are, where the reality seems to be a bit different. But wouldn't it be nice to have a more scientific approach to accounting?
I would certainly agree so. And there are definitely a few initiatives currently on the way in that space. For example, you have the International Accounting Standards Board and the IFRS, like literally the most common framework in terms of global accounting standards. They are now in the process of trying to collaborate with other organizations, such as, for example, the Global Reporting Initiative, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the Carbon Disclosure Project, and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Those are the 5 that now IFRS tries to intensify some of that collaboration in order to say what should be the standards. Because again, as you mentioned, accounting often depends on what sort of rule you apply in a certain case. And it sort of leaves a lot of room for interpretation, how a certain situation should be evaluated, and then apply the accounting rule in a specific way. And again, it can often be laid out to the benefit and in 2 various different ways, depending on what is the situation of the one who is doing the accounting and what is the specific context. Of course, also in sustainable finance, or in terms of reporting in the sustainable finance area, you also have to some extent that flexibility, because similar to traditional accounting, you also have the element of materiality and how material is something to a certain organization. So, for example, climate change can affect different organizations and different sectors in very different ways. So, or last year there was a Korean movie called Parasite, which won the Oscar. And within that, there was a scene that was very relevant to climate-related materiality or environment-related materiality. Is there was a very strong rain shower in the movie. And you have a rich family which lives uphill, and you have a poor family which lives downhill. And uphill, the rich family, they enjoy the rain shower in their garden. Their son is in the garden enjoying the rain. However, the poor family in the lower part of the city is literally drowning because their home is being flooded. That is how a situation affects actors in two different contexts and two different situations in a very different way. And that is also how climate change or environmental related matters affect different sectors or different stakeholders in a very different way. But in the end, it should always be science driven. It should always be look at the pure facts, because often with climate change, it's a physical reality. There's some room for interpretation, what could have caused things, but in the end, it's still a physical event that affected an asset to some extent. And that is where you need to have proper data. And in many cases, you need to have proper scientific data to really find out what was the root of the problem and how can we manage that problem moving forward? How can we create more resilience in terms of risk management? Or how can we make proactively the choices that allow us to basically generate overperformance in the future, in the mid to long term? And that is literally where you have already like what is called natural capital or nature-related accounting. So we need to get to a point where, at least in sustainable finance for non-financial elements, you have a proper scientific basis for any accounting or for any assurance or evaluation that you are doing. And that is extremely important in that space. So I do agree that we can learn from the accounting sector to some extent. However, it needs to become more rigid, and you need an additional component of science-based analysis and science-driven, data-driven accounting.
Just one more continuation on the topic. So one question is, what is captured in accounting today? How do you interpret it? But then the second question is also, of all the externalities that are currently not captured, which arguably, in order to have full sustainable picture, you need to take into account whether it's a nuclear power station that 70 years from now needs to be dismantled, where the cost is not included at all. Of course, the pollution that is created, etc. What is the current thinking around those externalities?
Of course, it's quite important how we, in terms of climate policy making and climate trajectory scenarios that we anticipate, for example, a 2-degree warming scenario where we need to reduce our carbon emissions quite drastically as foreseen under the Paris Climate Agreement. If you take that into account, of course, it will disproportionately affect certain assets much more than others. And moving forward, for example, in terms of potential write-offs or potential devaluation, you need to take stock of that. That is really important because some assets will be disproportionately affected while others will thrive under new regulatory environments or new physical realities for that matter. Because simply, for example, sea level rise will be quite an inevitability in some regions where even if you go forward with certain resilience measures, they will simply not be enough anymore. So we already past a certain threshold where the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 already have started sort of a domino effect to some extent. We can still reduce it and hopefully bring it down to manageable levels, but we already unleashed something that now we need to properly internalize, as you say. And in a lot of cases, the externalities that are currently being generated, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, power plants right now, those are externalities that should not even exist anymore at this point. They should already ceased. Hence, they are basically on the high risk of becoming stranded, what we call stranded assets. And that is something that really needs to be understood, that even for nuclear power plants or so, for whatever the risk was, like after Fukushima, it was a regulatory issue. And it was a public perception issue to a large extent. People didn't want nuclear anymore. And irrespective of the location where those nuclear power plants were located. Germany is a very good example. That is what shifted. But now with climate change and with environmental degradation, like deforestation, for example, those are things that have already advanced to such a degree that any asset that still contributes to that is under a risk of becoming obsolete or becoming high risk because either the regulatory environment changes or simply it's not profitable anymore because other technologies or so that are being developed in order to address these issues have become so competitive that economic actors will just naturally shift away because they're just much more profitable at some point. That is what we're seeing, for example, with wind power in the United States. Wind power is highly competitive, especially in the Midwestern states and in the Great Plains. You see that how sometimes what happens at the federal level is not necessarily indicative of what happens at a much more micro level, for example, at the state level, where often pragmatism and, of course, profitability and profitable business models outweigh any ideological concerns. If those technologies become competitive, that also means that certain asset classes will be much more vulnerable than others, especially those who still negatively have a negative impact on sustainability. That is a way of how to navigate externalities and externality-related risks.
ESG has been a hot topic in Japan at the very least, and certainly picking up globally as well. But in Japan, it was popularized when Mizuno-san took over the government pension investment fund in early 2015. Yeah. So he departed earlier this year after his contract ran out, but they're supposed to continue that. Can you describe a bit of the history behind it and what he did, please?
In 2015, and then subsequently with the passing of the Paris Agreement, even in Japan, which was hit by the triple disaster, earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear power disaster in 2011 in the northern Tohoku region of Japan. At that time, it seemed that the government who was in charge when the disaster happened, they wanted to shift away from coal. The first timeline was a shutdown of most of the coal plants by 2042. But that did not occur. So in November 2012, Abe-san, the former prime minister, he took over and he was confronted with strong wishes by the business community for cheap and reliable electricity. So Japan made a gradual shift away from nuclear because nuclear at that time was considered high risk and had to undergo certain safety measures and safety testing. In order to offset the loss of nuclear power in the grid, Japan turned to coal again. Coal and gas power plants. By doing so, of course, their CO2 output increased massively. Then it also became clear to some actors that there's also an inherent risk with such a strategy because Japan is already quite vulnerable to import-related disruption because they're very heavily reliant on commodity imports. In terms of investing, there can be a risk to the portfolio if you have very little diversification within your portfolio. Most of your holdings are domestic and heavily reliant on energy-intensive sectors. So when Mizuno-san took over, he first wanted to scan because at that time, sustainable finance was not that large of a term yet, but with the Paris Agreement and with the Sustainable Development Goals, it became much more prominent. So he started sort of a process of first trying to diversify. So sustainable finance was not the initial idea, was not the initial thought. That just occurred much later. The first goal was diversification, making sure that the government pension investment fund is not as exposed to domestic holdings. So they started to also outsource some of the asset managing to foreign asset managers. Previously, it was primarily handled by domestic asset managers. With that, sustainable finance emerged, green bonds, and climate-related risk disclosure. So Mizuno-san saw it as an opportunity to push diversification even further, and also acknowledging that climate-related risks will have an impact at some point in the future, and especially for such a long-term oriented asset owner such as GPIF, because pension funds are usually very conservative and adopt long-term strategies. So that was basically in line with them because they knew if we acknowledge that climate change and also global regulatory environments due to the Paris Agreement will shift at some point, then we also need to take those realities into account. And we need to basically create a more resilient portfolio that takes into account these long-term risks. That is how ESG investing came to the forefront because the GPIS was pushing for strategies that allow them to maintain solid returns and address material risks over the short, mid, and long term. And that is when ESG became a way of dealing with those long-term physical and transitional risks that emanate from climate change and from environmental ESG-related risks. And that is what he tried to push by also, for example, subscribing to certain indexes, hiring certain asset managers with a specific mandate, take account of ESG, screen for ESG risks. Certain reports, green bond collaborations were pushed with, for example, large multi-development banks. So that is how the GPIF acted as a catalyst for everything, because they have so much power, because the assets under management are just so large, their holdings are just so large that they have tremendous power. And since also the GPIF is quasi-governmental, if they are pushing for it, it can also have quite significant ramifications across government policy. That would mean there would likely also be some shifts in terms of regulation in Japan or in terms of policy guidance.
Looking at some of the GPIF reports, their statement is our responsibility is to current and future beneficiaries, and that obviously then crosses the generation. So they make the long-term aspect quite explicit in there. When you look at the impact that he had or GPIF had by making that switch and that diversification, do you think they have been successful yet in Japan specifically?
It depends on what the metrics for success are and what core indicators you're looking at. There was recently a piece in the Asia Nikkei review where Suga-san was talking about the future of Tokyo as a financial hub, where diversity is one of the key elements. So, for example, ESG is not only about environment. If we're talking about society at large and also providing for future beneficiaries, it is also about competitiveness. It is also about innovation, which also go along with the theme of sustainability. If it's, for example, diversity, and we see that only 8.8% of current board members are female and only 3.5% of current board members are foreigners, versus, for example, 47.7% of female board members in France or 36.6% of foreign board members in the UK, I think there's still a long way to go in order to achieve that. It shows that the GPIF certainly has impact. And if we see, for example, in the environmental sphere, that Suga-san, the new prime minister, recently announced that by 2050, Japan wants to become a net zero economy, that are hopeful signs. What was the role of the GPIF in that, in order to stimulate some of these discussions, or that it actually had a direct impact on those decisions? It's hard to say. There's probably discussions that you and me are not involved in that we do not know behind the scenes, but I can imagine that what the GPIF does, it will not be ignored. Let's put it like that. To what extent it shapes domestic policy is hard to tell, or whether domestic policy shapes the decision-making of the GPIF, how far that goes. I do believe it created a positive way of keeping ESG and sustainability in the news and in the discussion in the financial sector and across the investor community. It created sensibility around some of these terms that previously a lot of people in the financial sector never came across: ESG or climate-related risk disclosure. The GPIF produces solid research, and they do collaborate to an extent that they want to popularize some of these principles, but also financial products that integrate these principles. So I do think GPIF was able to make a difference.
So when you started laying out some of your interests, it was also about the data collection, making sure that there's data consistency, the data is reliable, etc. For anybody who's been involved with this type of data, is a Sisyphus type task. There's lots to be done, especially if you want to apply it globally. And how far do you think have we come?
In terms of environmental data, its crucial role to actually implementing sustainable finance strategies or ESG investment strategies cannot be overemphasized. It's really that crucial. And one of the problems is that in the past, and still in a lot of areas, producing high quality data is expensive and it takes time, especially because environmental processes are usually slow moving. If we look already at just, for example, forest growth, we're not talking about years, we're talking about decades already. And in this fast-moving environment, people expect data very quickly and they want data very quickly. And that often does not necessarily align with how natural processes work. And that is, I think, one of the things that is hardest to come by. So you have data sets that are usually produced by the government that were already collected over decades in the past, like, for example, biodiversity data also. But still, the government can only do so much due to the immense lack of data, be it biodiversity, be it anything relating to deforestation. That is really the crux, because if you want to have quality, consistent data, you need to carry it out not only for 1 year and then it's a one and done. You need to do it on a permanent basis. Often societies as well as companies, stakeholders are not willing to provide those funds to carry that out consistently. That is one of the barriers. So it's often like, it's considered cumbersome, lengthy, and expensive to produce high quality environmental data in a lot of areas. However, that being said, technology serves as instrument to alleviate some of these issues, because we already now have lots of satellites in the orbit that basically monitor a lot of different environmental factors, emissions, of course, being one of the main ones. But even for a lot of emissions where you would think technology is already refined for decades, no. For example, for methane emissions that have a huge role to play, for example, in gas wells, oil wells, and even coal wells, but also in agriculture, methane emissions. Until 2019, it was extremely hard for satellites to capture small level methane emissions in the atmosphere and specifically pinpoint the location where those emissions occurred, because the particles of methane are much finer than, for example, for CO2. It's much harder to capture them, and the sensors need to be much more sensitive. What did that lead to? It led to, for example, a lot of gas well operators in the United States, for example, that in the past did not properly report their methane emissions, can now be caught due to satellite technology being able to properly track and monitor methane emissions. So what happened after those news were reported? Suddenly, a lot of gas well operators started to report their emissions quite adequately, because previously either they did not have to report them because the government didn't compel them to, but now they can be proven, they can be associated with certain assets in terms of geography. It's pretty easy to find out who is operating that gas well and then say, like, yeah, you are not reporting that. We as investor, we do not feel comfortable, like, yeah, because your operations contribute to climate change to a much higher degree than we initially thought. So in terms of operating an ESG aligned portfolio, we don't want you anymore. That is where technology literally makes a difference. Another element is, for example, AI and blockchain. As they become more refined, they help extrapolate data much better due to algorithms being able to fill in gaps via artificial intelligence, via AI, via machine learning, in terms of reporting data, natural language processing, scanning data, and dealing with big data, these massive amounts of data, organizing them and basically separating the garbage from the valuable data has become a little bit easier. The problem still at the root is the lack of raw data, but technology certainly is now helping to alleviate some of these issues. And the satellite one is one of the most obvious ones. They also help, for example, track deforestation in a much better way. For example, in the Amazon as recently, or the bushfires in Australia last year. That is very important to bear in mind. I would be lying if I said there's no data problem at this point, because the lack of data, the lack of consistency, the lack of reporting is still ongoing and lead to, for example, in terms of those who use that data, ESG rating agencies or ESG labeling agencies who rely on ESG ratings or scores, they often find themselves with very divergent scores, because due to the data not being solid enough and such large gaps, it basically comes down to the methodology that these individual, ESG data providers or ESG service providers use. And that is often a human element, very subjective element plays into that. And that leads to largely disparate ratings. Sometimes the same company, like Tesla, for example, which gets very different ratings depending on the ESG rating agency. And that makes it very hard for investors to properly evaluate what company is actually worth investing in.
You see these press releases from major global banks who say that we're not giving loans out anymore for things that are bad for the planet. How much of that is actually real? How much of that can they actually assess even at the project level? Because that requires, at a minimum, an additional process in the loan approval, if not a refactored, completely changed view as to how you approve loans and how you go about seeking that business out as well.
I would say that currently many of the global banks do not have the resources and or the structures in place to do that risk analysis enough to make sure that they are not financing any activities that are detrimental. Some of the ESG related activities are currently not living up to that moniker in the sense that it could be qualified even as greenwashing, because a lot of organizations simply do not give themselves the resources, the proper resources to manage these risks and analyze whether or not, for example, a loan that they are procuring is actually mitigating their risk exposure, or at the same time also addressing risks to the environment and to the climate that could occur due to financing certain operations. For example, there's a lot of talk about the divestment movement, about moving away from coal and, for example, divesting or not procuring loans or loan guarantees, underwriting, insurance underwriting anymore to coal operations. But you need to give yourself the resources and the proper expertise. And that is something that I feel is very under discussed right now, that there's a lot of so-called experts that work for large organizations that often are the head of sustainability or head of sustainable finance, head of ESG investing, that have very little proper experience in sustainability matters or in environment related matters, in climate related matters. They often do like a month-long sustainability leadership course or a 2-month online introductory course to ESG. And then afterwards, they consider themselves sustainability experts. And I think that is very dangerous in the sense that it can lead to greenwashing. If I'm an investor, if I'm an asset owner, I would be very much aware that that is a very significant risk if you do not have someone who properly has ever dealt with sustainability. And in the future, I believe that we cannot have one head of ESG investing. We need someone with financial expertise, and we need someone who has equal standing, who has a non-financial background. That needs to be absolutely made clear. We cannot continue the status quo also in terms of organizational structures and in terms of management structures, because it's those very management structures where it's usually just seen you only have one head. That is what is needed in terms of governance in order to make sure that there's no greenwashing occurring, because I always use the image of the medical profession. If you undergo brain surgery, if you're the patient, would you want to be operated by someone who just read a book about brain surgery? Or would you rather want to be operated by a proper brain surgeon who not only went to medical school, but also has been working in that field? I would rather want to be operated, if my life is on the line, by that person, and not just someone who is aware of everything around brain surgery, but who has never even come in contact with a scalpel before.
These incumbent companies have an inherent culture that has developed over decades often. And now are all these new things popping up, and we're creating appendices of everything that attached to the main body, but sit somewhat remote. So you got the chief sustainability officer, you got the chief innovation officer and an innovation center, you've got the chief diversity and inclusion officer, and it's just not part of the mainstream culture of that company. It sits on the outside, and maybe I should go as far as saying just the boxes tick. The moment you create it as a separate function, it always has the risk of giving the rest of the organization an excuse to say they are responsible for that. While if you were to create a company from scratch today, you would take all these things, mesh it together with everything you know about leadership and management, and bake it into one consistent, coherent culture. And that doesn't work well for the incumbents.
I think so. And there was a very interesting study. I do not fully remember the exact details, but I think it went along the lines of that an overwhelming majority of board members that are assigned to sustainability have no proper knowledge of sustainability. That really goes to show that we still have a long way to go in terms of making sustainability sort of like a staple of any board level, like decision making, especially informed decision making, because a lot of boards, they assign someone to sustainability, but it just goes that far. You also need to basically have the underlying knowledge and the underlying expertise. So you need to appoint people to boards that have that expertise, that have that knowledge. In Japan, no change will occur unless there's a change of mind at the top. And that is why it was so important that Mizuno-san of the GPAF was fostering that change, because he was able to change things that really led to positive change. I would want to finish on that note is that through leadership leads to change. But you need to have people who first acknowledge that there's a problem in the first place, or that there's a challenge in the first place, and provide the adequate resources and also some freedom to those who select to implement said measures to manage that. And only then, if really at the top of boards, of company boards, or at the the regulators and the government, I hope that now, like with some of these announcements, that those are sincere announcements. If that is followed through, I think we will see real change that will make a lasting impact.
So the opportunity is there, it needs to be taken.
Exactly. I think the opportunities are manifold. And I would also urge any one of your listeners to also promote diversity and engage in collaboration. We need interdisciplinary collaboration. We need the technology sector to collaborate with the financial sector, collaborate with the scientific sector, with academia. We need much more because the challenges are just so complex. So it's not enough that everyone remains in their corner and tries to develop their own solutions to a problem that cannot be solved in isolation. That is really the takeaway. If you do collaborate, if you do stimulate, if you create an open environment, if you build the structures that allow for that to happen without too much top-down interference, that is really where the solutions can occur. The regulators are still important, but it is very important for innovation to happen. You need to promote diversity and you need to promote open environments, because mandated innovation is very hard to sustain, because mandated innovation is the opposite of innovation. For innovation to happen is also you need to disruption allowed to happen. If you do not allow disruption, if you do not allow the status quo to be broken up, so those structures that currently exist, if you don't allow those to be broken up, if you just want tiny modifications of the existing status quo, that will not lead to the fundamental innovation that Japan is seeking, for example, with its FinTech innovation, FinCity, becoming the next financial hub. That will be very difficult to achieve. Leadership requires the willingness to allow disruption and innovation to happen. And I think that is a very good takeaway for this episode.
Thank you very much, Kim.
Thank you for having me once again.